Data migration is simply the process of moving your data from one source to another. The way you can see how it's performed in the different services is as you see it here in the image. For SQL Server, you access and migrate SQL Server databases to several destinations. For Cosmos DB, you can access and migrate various NoSQL databases to Cosmos DB. For Azure SQL, you access and migrate databases to the Azure SQL family of services. And for third-party, there is support for many third-party database migrations. So at the end of the day, you can basically move most any database into Azure with ease. Let's walk through something of a scenario to understand all of the different pieces involved. Let's say that you wanted to migrate an on-premises SQL Server to Azure SQL. In that scenario, you can start off with an Azure Migrate project. It's going to have some metadata about assessment. Okay, and then you're going to have your own on-premises environment that you want to evaluate. Now, if we're working with a SQL Server, we can actually use the Data Migration Assistant. We install that on the server, we connect it up to our database, and it can help us assess whether or not we're ready to migrate across to some other service. Now, it's worth highlighting here that Data Migration Assistant is just for SQL products, but the Database Migration Service itself can actually support a range of products, as we just spoke about. Now, if you were migrating a SQL Server to Azure SQL, what you're firstly going to use is the DMA tool to migrate your schema from your on-premises database across to Azure SQL. Now, you actually also use the Data Migration Assistant to migrate the database as well, but remember this tool is just for SQL products. If you are migrating some other sort of database across to an Azure Data Platform, then you can use the Database Migration Service. Now, the Database Migration Service is not assessing the migration, it's just actually performing the migration. And for it to do so, we need to deploy a Database Migration Service to the virtual network. And that Database Migration Service within that virtual network needs to have connectivity to our source database to actually then go on right across to our destination database. So again, we're going to use the DMA to perform assessments, and we're working with SQL products. If we're working with some other product and we're just focused on the actual migration, then that's where we use the Database Migration Service. The Database Migration Service sits in that VNet, so it needs to have connectivity to our source database, as well as connectivity to our destination database. When we perform the migration with the Database Migration Service, we can either do so online or offline. Now, for online, as it kind of sounds like we're going to get that continuous synchronization, we're going to have a cutover. It's going to be really minimal downtime. The replication of data is going to occur behind the scenes. And when we're ready, we perform that migration, and there's just a minimal time and we have that cutover. If you use the offline mode, as soon as you actually start synchronizing that data, you're going to shut down the source database, which of course means that any applications you have talking to that database will go offline as well. And now when we deploy the Database Migration Service, if we want to use online migrations, we need to use the premium SKU.